discovered were lunar eclipses that date to the Babylonian period, which was 2000 BC. Astrologers didn't think that there was the Mesopotamians that practiced astrology didn't think that there was a direct causal connection between celestial and earthly events, instead acting as the signs and indications of the future that were sent by the gods, not causes of events that they correlated with. So the stars were seen as a heavenly writing that was inscribed across the sky. So, like, in other words, they didn't really necessarily think that the planets themselves were causing the events to happen on Earth, but rather they were mapped out as intentions from the gods themselves. The earliest form of astrology that was practiced in Mesopotamia was called mundane astrology, which is the practice of like world events, basically like, governing large groups of people, and figuring out like where, what happens, to, in the state, the area, the city. So like so the kings of Mesopotamia would employ the astrologers as like a state affair. So under the patronage of the king. So I want to bring up something here. Can anybody see that?
No. Down the bottom, it says share screen.
Yeah. Come on.
It's coming up.
Okay. So I wanted to talk about the connection between astrology and astronomy from, that period up until the 8th century. The astrology and astronomy were intertwined. In fact, that they all they were as one. So, as an astrologer, you had to be an astronomer. So like they assumed both duties. So like the side effects, the side effects of the study of astrology, they made, or about developing complex mathematical astronomy, because they didn't have, the Mesopotamians didn't have everything written down, because so Mesopotamia, it was simplistic, was what I mean to say. It was about studying solar eclipses, lunar eclipses. They didn't have everything recorded, so everything was very basic. It wasn't until like the 8th century that they started to record, what planet is in what sign, and the cycles of the planets, of how long it takes to circle the ecliptic. That developed later on. So then what happened was, like, along the way, what separated the two subjects, astronomy and astrology, it was because after the astrologers were able to map out and like had everything recorded and written down, that they didn't need to observe the sky because everything was written down. So they still worked together, but that was it slowly started to diverge and become separate. In today's times, astrology and astrologers and astronomers don't really quite get along, but it's just important to note that at one time they were, one and the same. So so anyway, as I said, the 8th century, that took place, and in fact, like, and I want to point out something here. Anybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. See, this is a clay tablet of the astrological, you know, scripture. So like nothing could be done. They list the planets and the signs, the date, the emperor, and they would in the bottom of these, which was interesting, they would say like good luck in every one of these. Like so, about like 28 were found during this period. So what we think what was like, so the astronomer would calculate the planets, give the clay tablet to whoever wanted their chart done, and then like take it to the astrologer, and the astrologer would orally interpret it, because we don't have any evidence of like anything past like what you know, planets and what signs and anything past that, because we think, you know, you would imagine it would take a lot of time to, you know, if you were going to do a report, it would probably take 15 years to write a report on a clay tablet. So everything had to be done orally. But natal astrology, in which it came in the 5th century BC. So I was getting ahead of myself there, but like, so they started to lean themselves off mundane astrology. So natal astrology is one's birth chart. So taking the moment of, you know, somebody who was born and then casting a chart. So that became very popular in the 5th century, as well as the zodiac. The 12-line zodiac was finally incorporated also in the 5th century BC. So like, and also, so like every sign was made up of 30 degrees. But they knew that not all the signs were the same size, because they're all different sizes. Like Virgo's the largest constellation, is Capricorn's the smallest. But the fitting that, part of that too is fitting it under the calendar, because as I talk about Egyptian a little bit, the Egyptians based their calendar on 12 months, 30 days, with 5 extra days at the end of the year. So anyway, after the 5th century, astrology became more advanced, and a number of new technique and concepts were introduced. Now, the Mesopotamians, they were more focused on trying to learn the cycles of the planets, trying to learn what they mean, as well as the aspects between planets. Whereas ancient Egypt, they were focused on what was called, let me see if I can find it, the deacons, which this is the best example I could show you. Does anybody can see that?
Nope, not yet.
Right, now? Is it now or no?
Down the bottom, share screen.
Okay.
It's coming up.
All right, this is like the best example I could give of what the deacons would look like. So on the outer ring here is all the signs of the zodiac, and these, as you can see, planets are separated by 10 degrees each, right? So you have like, so the Egyptians, although like they didn't use this astrologically, they were using the deacons as to mark the hours in the night, and the deacons were also not just like the 10-degree signs, but also aligned with the fixed stars. So they were focused on the fixed stars and what hour of the night. So it wasn't until later that they started to associate these 10-degree segments into all the astrological signs. And also Egypt at the time, they were focused on the rising and culmination of the planets. So the setting of the sun, the rise of the sun, the rise of the planets. So each quadrant you know, like where the planet was in the sky, that Egypt was focused on what it means. So it was a precursor to, if anybody's familiar with astrology, it's the precursor to the 12 houses, which would then later become a part of the tradition later on. So then now like Mesopotamia was doing its own thing as they were getting better and more complex in their system. Egypt was sort of like adapting, and they were looking at Mesopotamia to, you know, what they were doing. But I think Mesopotamia wasn't, because there was also a language barrier between the two countries or two areas, that, you know, there wasn't a lot of communication between the two. But Egypt did take notice of what Mesopotamia was doing. So they started to adapt some of the things that they were doing, like the zodiac. And I want to point. All right, does anybody see this?
Yes.
Okay, this was constructed in around 200 BC. It's in the Temple of Dendera. So what it is the outer is, I believe, the fixed stars, and inside is the constellations of the astrological signs. So like, so also in the 5th century, what I forgot to mention was there was a text of astrological omens that was translated into into Egyptian language and transmitted from Mesopotamia to Egypt. And also at the time when the Mesopotamians invented the zodiac, Egypt incorporated the zodiac, you know, into their deacon system. So now, like, I want to get to so after Alexander the Great conquered all of Persia, and they started to become a Greek-speaking language, that was when the two systems merged. Now, like, there's an argument in the astrological community about whether that was a sudden invention or it was gradually incorporated, because we don't have a record of, you know, how it came to be. So it was roughly around the 1st century BC is when they started to that it came together, and then you had this, you know, like complex system of astrology. So one is what's called the benefics. So for example, like, this is a very simplistic thing. So you have two group of planets that are benefic and malefic. So Aphrodite and Zeus, if you will, would be benefic, and Mars, Saturn, which is Aries and Kronos, would be malefic. They started to notice that certain planets were, you know, indicated, you know, like whether it was going to be positive or a negative influence. So, and part of that too is like the color. I think the color of the stars, too, like they, you know, Mars is like a red, very reddish color, whereas Saturn is like a brown, whereas the, you know, Venus and Jupiter are very, very light and bright. So then so basically, like, now, like, so the Hellenistic tradition, you know, it developed in itself. So it was very strong up until the 7th century when like, you know, the Islamic Empire conquered, well, I should say, I'm sorry, Alexandria, the city in Egypt, was basically the area where that astrology was practiced in the Hellenistic period. So, you know, like, if you wanted to be an astrologer or an astronomer, you would go to Alexandria. And that ties into the Alexandria Library. And so, like, there was a very advanced, you know, scholarship there. So once the Islamic Empire took over after the 7th century, the Islamic Empire started to, they went to, you know, like, the Islamic Empire, once they took over Alexandria, they took some of what Alexandria had and took it back to, Persia, Middle East. And then so like the Islamic Empire had like a 200, I'm sorry, they experienced a period between the 700 to, I think it was like the 13th century, whereas they were practicing astrology before it went back to Europe. And so a lot of things were lost in time, because there was a lot of texts that were found in the 90s that were dug up about different, different, different texts involving like the techniques that we're just learning now, that what the Mesopotamians and the Hellenistic astrologers did. So then when you're translating text from, Hellenistic to Arabic to Latin to English or whatever, whatever language, things get lost. So a lot of things that we've uncovered since the 90s, that we are starting to learn how they did astrology. One thing, the fate and free will argument. I also forgot to note that, during the Mesopotamian period and the Hellenistic period, they whereas today, like we're more like open about fate and free will. Like some people might favor fate, some people might favor free will, some people may be in the middle. The ancient astrologers were heavily favored fate over free will, because they believed that whatever was meant to happen, that was what you were supposed to be, and that was what you were supposed to do. So like they just like, and part of that too was knowing, like through the sky, like whatever it was you were meant to be or to do, or whatever it was, like, whether good or bad, just be humble, because that's what your soul chose. But I'm not sure if I have anything else. Does anybody have anything?
So, Michael, we are recording this for tomorrow night. My understanding is, and there aren't a whole lot of people here, but does anybody have any questions for Michael? I'm not really sure if they're even at their computer at the moment. Major information, some of it for me to build on my small knowledge of astrology. My grandmother was an astrologer, but she did like a column for the Courier Post back in the day. I don't know that anybody has any questions in here. I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
It's a beautiful graphic.
Somebody there?
This is Amar.
Amar.
It's a beautiful graphic. I love the.
Yes, it is.
The yin and yang of it.
No, I also forgot to mention too. Can anybody see this?
Yes.
Okay. At some point during the Hellenistic period, and it might have either there's no evidence, of Mesopotamia doing this, but I suspect that they noticed too. But certain planets work in certain signs. So, like for example, like the sun is best in Leo because during that period between late July and late August, that's where the sun's the strongest. So they would always associate Leo with the sun, and also the moon with Cancer, because having the two luminaries in the longest days of the year, whereas Saturn was the furthest and the coldest planet, where they would have like Aquarius and Capricorn, the two signs that are opposite Leo and Aquarius, as the as the opposite effect. So you have cold and warm. You know what I mean? So, but also like each planet, like had its own sign. So they also believed if a person had as many planets in their chart that was in its own sign, that was a very fortunate thing. So I just wanted to note that too. So and also there was a thing, and I don't expect anybody, can anybody see this?
Don't remember seeing that.
Okay. Or can anybody see it on the screen now? I just changed it. Because I don't know if it's working or not. I just changed
Um,
Hold on, let me see again.
we can see it. It's just not very big.
Okay. So, like, I don't expect anybody to know this, but this graphic here is where certain planets go with certain houses. They operate best under those houses. So that was a technique that the Hellenistic astrologers came up with that we've lost over the years. Like in modern astrology. So again, and this is another thing right here. So, like during the Hellenistic period, can everybody see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is sort of what I have here is a, on the outside is the name that they used to call each house. So like, and the indications of what each house means. And nothing's really changed that much, but it's interesting that some of the wording that they had, for like, and even in ancient times, because like, again, like I said, like this was all put together. You're putting Egypt and Mesopotamia together, and this is what you get. So you get the concept of 12 houses, the combination of planets. Like when they hit a certain point of the sky, the rulership scheme, planets working in certain signs. But like I don't want to go too much because I don't.
Okay, there is a question here from Byron, or Brian. I'm sorry, Brian. What is the origin of the deacons? And it says, what are your opinion of the effects of the precession of the equinoxes on astrology?
Okay, so that was they didn't have that issue. The precession, they didn't have that issue in ancient times because everything, like everything was aligned. So like the stars, so they move like 1 degree every, I think, 72 years. So there's this big argument between like, so like the astrology that Westerners use, which is us, is tropical. So we base our astrology off the seasons. In India, they use what's called the sidereal zodiac, and that's based on what the like the planets, like they would be under that specific star. So for example, all right, so I'm born September 7th, right? I'm a Virgo, but according to the sidereal zodiac, I'm actually a Leo because it's a 25-degree difference. So it's just a matter of how they do in India. Like in India, mostly uses sidereal, but I don't know too much about Indian astrology because I haven't studied Indian astrology, but what they have works for them. And my feeling is that if you go to if you look at the fixed stars, if they're, because like also the fixed stars have meanings too, and that's a whole another subject too. So like for example, so I'm at, I think 20 degrees Leo's would be my sidereal sign. So I don't agree with I don't agree with that, like for me, because I know I'm a Virgo and I feel that way, but I might look at that and think, okay, what does the fixed star around 20 degrees Leo indicate? Maybe that's what I would look at. I don't know if that helps answer that.
All right, I believe Amora has another question.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the the star, I guess, Sirius, or the and because the
Yeah, I
Mesopotamian,
was going to put that in my.
they had this connection with Nibiru. They
Yes. Well, I didn't get to it in my presentation, but in Egypt, so the flooding of the Nile happened every. It would flood what from like June to September, I think. Um, so Sirius was actually like the point where so they would look at which the ascendant I didn't even bring up in my presentation, but that was an important thing for the Mesopotamians, Egyptians, and as the tradition developed, was knowing what sign is rising on the horizon. So uh, like they would look at it was around late July, the sun was in Leo. So when you have Cancer rising around 14 degrees, and Sirius actually lies at 14 degrees Cancer, so they would mark that as the beginning of the Egyptian calendar at that point, and the Nile would flood, like right when Sirius was rising on 14 degrees Cancer. I don't know if that's what you were.
right, yeah, I know they were aware of that. They called it Nibiru instead of Sirius, but is that the connection to the Lionsgate
Have
thing that
they?
happens
Yeah.
August 10th?
What's that? I'm sorry.
So today, in modern times, there's this thing in the New Age community where there's a Lionsgate portal on around August 10th, August 8th through 10th. That's like supposed to be this big opening of lots of energy and stuff like that. And I think it's related to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I don't know anything about what you were talking
Okay,
about, but I do know that. Can you excuse me for a second? Sorry. Hold on.
sure. Yeah. I had a place in our Facebook page where we were talking about the Lionsgate portal.
Yeah. Well, I know that like I said, the Egyptians they were really focused on the fixed stars part of it, and like their timing was different because they associated it with the calendar too. They were connecting all the fixed stars and the deacons, with the calendar, and so eventually, and it didn't start off. They didn't use it astrologically at first. It wasn't until they were learning from Mesopotamia they started to incorporate the deacons with with what the Mesopotamians were doing. Um, and they would hold rituals of like marking the hours of the night. So I mean, like the Mesopotamians, it took centuries to figure out what they were doing. Um, so everything but it just seems to me that like the Mesopotamians, they were focused on so much perfecting that I don't think that they didn't they I don't think they counted out what Egypt was doing. It just feels like Egypt was more adapting to what Mesopotamia was doing. And I think was the key there too, before everything came together. You know what I mean? So, you know, so like, Mesopotamia, they really, because again, without their knowledge, their, record, like keeping track of, the cycles of the planets and, and everything else, we wouldn't have anything to go by. We wouldn't have the astrology we have today without their record of, the cycles of the planets, you know what I mean, and timing everything because, and again, look how long it took. They started in 4000 BC, all the way to the 8th century. They started recording it, so the future astrologers and astronomers relied on their recordings to know what's going to be when and and where. Anything.
Thank you.
Anybody have anything?
Okay, Amara, should I stop now? I want to
So
thank
yeah,
you.
thank you, Michael, so much
Thank
for
you.
that. It was so interesting, and I'm definitely gonna, listen to it again when we play it.
Yeah.
I
Sorry for
appreciate your flexibility.
Yeah,
so nervous.
No, it was great. Thank you so much.
it was great. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Have a nice night.
You
Many
too.
blessings to you. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you.